Hey everyone, welcome on in. We're going to get started in just a minute here. All right, well, now that it's 7 p.m., let's jump on in. So welcome to IB Experience's webinar on how to prepare for the SAT and ACT, a topic of particular interest at the moment with the new introduction of the digital SAT. My name's Jim Wismer. I'm the director of IB Experience. I see from our participant list that some of you know me, some of you may not. I'm joined by our assistant director of tutoring, Tori Burke. Together, Tori and I, run the tutoring side of IB Experience, especially our test prep. We oversee planning with our families for when to take the test, matching families with tutors, and oversight of the entire process from start to finish. So today, I wanted to start off by talking about what is the point of standardized testing. So in this world where so many colleges are test optional, and don't worry, we'll talk about that in a little bit, why are test scores still used? So first of all, a test score is used to predict student success at college. Of all of the things that statistically correlate with student success at college, the number one is high school GPA, and the number two is scores from the SAT and ACT. So that is still true, even though the scores are optional. And colleges, of course, they want to admit students who are going to be successful on campus. So the idea is that standardized test scores help them do that. It also allows a college to compare you with your local context. So part of what goes with your college application to a college is something called a school profile or school report, which is a description of several things about your schools, including, what AP or IB courses are offered at the school, what percentage of the students graduate and go to college, and one of these pieces of information is the average SAT and ACT score from your high school. So colleges are able to see what the average score is that a student is applying from and compare that student's score with their circumstances. And then the important thing to remember about standardized testing is that it's a piece of a holistic review process. So standardized test scores are not, of course, the only factor. They are one factor of many when it comes for colleges to, make decisions about whether to admit students or not. Now, in terms of planning for the SAT or ACT, there are essentially 7 steps in the process. And we're going to go through each of these one by one and everything you need to know in order to make the right decision for your family and for your student. So I won't just read them off on the slide here because we're going to be going through them in much more depth later. But before we do, I want to talk a little bit about the timeline for this upcoming digital SAT. So I'm sure many of you have heard of it. I see from our attendee list here that we have sort of a combination of rising juniors and rising sophomores here. So for the digital SAT, I'm going to focus on the domestic timeline here. If you've heard of students already taking it abroad, that's because everything internationally is 1 year ahead of what's happening in the US. But the domestic timeline is that the PSAT this fall will be in the digital version of the test. The SAT will go fully digital in March of next year. So that is to say, for our rising juniors, March of their junior year. Now, for the rising sophomore families that are attending, all of your SATs and PSATs will be digital no matter what. But for the rising juniors, they have the opportunity to take the paper SAT in the fall, and we're going to talk about who that does make sense for and who that doesn't make sense for shortly.
So there are a couple of ways to decide between decide the timeline that you're going to take your SAT and ACT on. And this is even more important now that we've got this digital option coming in. So the very first way that we decide what that timeline is going to look like is what math classes your student has already taken. So the sort of the heart and soul of both of these exams in the maths portion is the fundamental algebra 2 and geometry skills. So we would really only recommend that a student starts prepping for those math sections once they have taken those courses, algebra 2 and geometry, or their equivalents at whatever high school that the student might attend. Additionally, we want to know like what their real life circumstances are. So every student has a different sort of slate of wonderful activities that they're up to, and they might decide that they don't want to prep during their spring musical. They don't want to prep during the height of their baseball season, what have you. So we want to take those things into account. Obviously that it is possible to prep during those times, as we'll talk about in a little while, but we want to take those things into account. Also, we want to know what's the student's mental health like. So maybe a student just is not in a place where they want to be taking the test at the same time as they're doing their coursework, and that's totally reasonable. Or maybe you happen to know that your student is not going to do well with digital testing, or maybe they'll do much better with digital testing. These are all things that really like you need to be keeping in mind when we're making a timeline, and those are all things that we're more than happy to discuss how they might impact which tests we recommend taking and when.
Yeah. And I forgot to mention this up front, but if you have any questions at any point during this presentation, please ask them in either the chat or the Q&A. We're going to open it up for a Q&A at the end of the presentation, but just write out the questions while you think of them so that you don't miss them, and they'll stay there until we're ready.
So these are the tests that we would recommend targeting if your student is going to be prepping over the summer with us. And we would pretty much recommend that any student, if they have the time, and have already taken those algebra 2 and geometry or their equivalents at their high school, should try to prep the summer before their junior year and target these tests as their first test date. And the SAT will still be on paper at that point. And then these are the tests that we'd recommend taking if your student has not yet taken algebra 2 or geometry and is going to be targeting a slightly later timeline. So you'll note that all of these SATs are digital, as will all SATs be going forward.
All right, so I wanted to talk through a couple hypothetical situations with a student trying to determine their testing timeline, just to give you a sense of what we mean, because it's easy to say, you know, oh, if you've taken this math, think about your schedule, blah, blah, blah. But let's make it a little concrete with some examples. So our first case study here is a student who has completed algebra 2 and geometry as of the end of 10th grade. And they are a fall sport athlete. That's their most important extracurricular activity for them. So for this student, we would recommend to aim to take the test as early as possible in the fall. The idea is that the student will be able to prepare over the summer when they're not having to balance school and the sport and test prep all at once. You know, sports practices will pick up in August, school will start end of August, beginning of September, but they're not going to have much overlap between school, sport, and test prep, which is that acuity, all that time pressure all at once that we want to avoid. If this student does need to retake the test, most students will take the test, by the way, because super scoring is a policy that's out there. We'll talk a little bit about that later. But if this student does choose to retest, then they should retest in December. Fall sports will typically end around mid-November. The idea being they'd have about a month to kind of ramp up for that retake for any refreshers that they need to be prepared. So now let's take a look at a different student. So what we have here is a winter athlete who is taking algebra 2 or geometry during their junior year. So this student is going to want to aim for one of the end of junior year tests, because that's when they'll have all of the math. So they will start their prep in March after their sport ends, and then they could take the test in the May SAT or June ACT, the idea being that they get to retake in the June SAT or July ACT dates. And then, of course, they'd have a sort of third backup plan in the fall of senior year, if necessary. Now, this student could start sooner in the summer or the fall to focus on the verbal sections of the test, even if they don't have all that math under their belt yet. if they felt like they needed a longer timeline because of a bigger score increase being necessary, or if they just wanted to sort of knock some of it out before the school year. And it's important to remember that, we're using these example of athletes and avoiding the sports season. Athletes can prepare during their season. It just tends to be much more difficult for them to do so. And the same goes, we're talking about athletes, the same goes if you're very involved in musical theater, or robotics club, and you have a particularly acute competition season. So, any activity you can replace athletics with and sort of apply these same principles. And I should also mention that we offer free planning calls to all of our families to help figure out the testing timeline for the particular student. So we're not just doing the webinar and then, putting you out to the wolves, but we'll be here to guide you through the process the whole way.
So one of the most common questions that we get every single year is, well, I hear you about all these factors, but I've heard from my neighbor or my cousin or my cousin's boyfriend or what have you, that this one test date has a much harder curve than all the other ones because that's when the seniors are taking it and they're really down to the wire. And we are here to tell you that this is a myth, and we promise it is a myth. The SAT curves are predicted. They are not based on test day performance. So you might sometime, if any of you have older students that have already taken the test, you might have them come home. Hopefully they knew in advance, but maybe not. But there was a 5th section and they're like, oh, I don't know what happened. That's because they do some experimenting with these sections before the test date comes. They see how people do, and it's based on those predicted curves. So there are easier and harder curves throughout the year, but they are distributed completely randomly, and they're not at all based on the time of year or who's taking it or anything like that.
All right. So what I'd like to do now is go through our sort of menu of options here. So we've been talking about the timeline, but now it's time to talk about how do you choose between the SAT and the ACT. And for these rising juniors who might have a choice between the paper SAT and the digital SAT, how do you make that choice? So the paper SAT, which is the version that has been in place since 2016, it consists of 4 sections. There's a reading section, writing and language, which is grammar, and then 2 math sections, one where you can't use a calculator and one where you can. It's scored out of 1600. So parents, this would be the way that most of you were scored on the SAT, though I'll note, to kind of massage your egos a little bit, that scores on the test now are inflated from what they were when you took the test by about 100 points. It depends on where you are in the curve. So parents, if you're trying to compare yourself to your kids, you can give yourself an extra 100 points on the test. Now, the biggest challenges on the paper SAT, number one, there are long reading passages, and some of them are from quite a long time ago, historical passages. Often they'll center around the topics of abolition or women's liberation or other key moments in American history. And these passages are typically written in an older idiom of English, which is much more difficult for students to read. The no calculator section is something we consistently get feedback from students about, feeling that that's more challenging. Now, granted, you don't really need a calculator very much in the no calculator section, but there are some places where it would be nice to have, and they don't have it. And then in general, the SAT's kind of hallmark is the complexity of questions, as opposed to the ACT, where the questions tend to be a little more straightforward. So the digital SAT is, first of all, scored exactly the same as the new test. Fundamentally, one of the differences is that the reading and writing sections are combined. So instead of having reading and then writing, you have reading and writing number 1, and then reading and writing number 2, with no difference in format, same number of questions and everything. And the same goes with the math. Now the math is still split into 2 sections, but you can use a calculator that's built into the test the whole time. Students, it's the Desmos graphing calculator, if any of you have used it in your math or science classes at school. The biggest challenges that we've kind of encountered so far for the digital SAT are, one, there are very limited annotation tools. So as test prep tutors, one of the things we're doing is teaching students how to mark up their tests properly. Now, there are some basic tools in the tests, like crossing out answer choices and things like that, that are available. But it is relatively limited, the freedom you have to annotate as you wish. You do get scratch paper, but it's not quite the same thing as marking up the test directly. The verbal questions on the new test are more challenging. Now, the passages are shorter and students tend to like that. So where that old SAT would have long passages with about 10 questions, the new test, each question is its own short passage. So you're reading a paragraph, answer a question, read a paragraph, answer a question. And while students do tend to say to us that, yeah, that sounds way better than reading long passages, the level of the questions that you're being asked is actually much more challenging on this version of the test. The College Board has promised that scores on the paper version of the test and scores on the digital version of the test will be exactly comparable. And so in order for that to be true, that means the same percentage of the students need to be scoring at each score level. So while we hear from every student that, oh, I'm going to do way better on the digital SAT, the simple fact of the matter is that for every 50% of them that do, 50% will not. College Board, it's not the most transparent company in the world. It's not the most student-friendly company in the world. But if there's one thing I trust them with, it's statistics. If they say that the scores are going to be equivalent, they mean that the scores are going to be equivalent. And that means that it can't be true for every student that this digital test is just easier. It won't play out that way in the scores. And then finally, the new test is adaptive. And so what that means is that essentially in the first module of reading and writing or math, every student will get the same difficulty level. It'll be a standardized difficulty level. Based on your performance in that first module, you will be either given a more challenging or less challenging second module. So this adaptive component of the test is a little bit of a distinction without a difference, but it definitely messes with students' head a little bit from what we've gathered. So students will be sort of in their own head about like, oh, well, I have to, make sure I do well enough in the first module to get the harder second module so I could get the highest possible score. And there's some truth to that. But at the end of the day, of course, the way that you get the highest possible score on the test is you look at question number 1, you focus really hard on it, and you answer it correctly. And then you look at question 2, and you focus really hard on it, and you answer it correctly. And then you do the same thing for 3 and 4 and 5, all the way through the test. So, parents and students have asked us like, oh, well, what's the strategy you're teaching around the adaptive nature of the test? The strategy is get the questions right. So the more questions you get right, the better chance you have of getting the other second module. The other thing is that the students who get the less challenging second module, it means that they missed a certain, they missed questions in the first module that caused that to happen. And so if you miss that many questions on the current version of the test, you're already not getting a score, above 700. So it's not like the idea of if you miss a lot of questions early on the test, you're locked out of certain scores is a new thing. That's already the case on the current paper version of the test. So the adaptive nature of the test, we put it under challenges here because it's more of a challenge of students' mindset than a challenge of like practically what you need to do to get a higher score. Because at the end of the day, answering as many questions correctly as possible is still the way to get the highest score. That hasn't changed at all. Okay, so those are the 2 SATs that we're dealing with. So what about the ACT? So the ACT consists of 4 sections: English, math, reading, and science. And so right away, you see one of the big differences is that the ACT has this science section. Now it's really a science section in the sense that it doesn't really test your knowledge of science. There are certain basic things you need to know about science, but it doesn't test a depth or level of knowledge in science. It really tests students' ability to interpret information in the context of science experiments. So they explain a science experiment or scientific study. They give you the data in some kind of visual format, a table, a scatter plot, a bar graph. And then they ask students to interpret that information. So this skill is also tested on both versions of the SAT. In fact, the SAT has more science content in the other sections of the test, including reading and writing and language, than the ACT does. So the ACT science section, it gives you a science score, but you're not escaping the skills tested in ACT science by not taking the ACT because the SAT is going to test them as well. The scoring on the ACT is quite different. It's out of 36. There is a way to convert the scores. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. In general, the biggest challenge of the ACT is finishing the test on time. Students are going to find that they struggle to finish the test on time. It's very rare that we have a student that can actually complete all sections of the ACT without having to sweat it. So even our highest performing students are usually right up against the time limit in at least some of the sections. And with that comes fatigue, because you're having to go so quickly that you sort of don't have a moment to catch your breath. So the timing and fatigue factors kind of go hand in hand as the big challenge on the ACT. Conversely, though, we mentioned that the SAT has more complex questions. The trade-off on the ACT, that time limit is tougher, but you get a lower level of complexity in the questions, so that if a student looked at one ACT question and one SAT question, in general, they're going to tend to find that the scores, most of them are going to find the ACT single question easier in a vacuum. It's when you add the time limit that the tests overall are going to be the same difficulty level. Another unique challenge of the ACT, and this only applies, by the way, for very high achieving math students, but in the most difficult math questions on the ACT, the topics rotate more than they do on the SAT, which is to say that there's a little bit of whack-a-mole in test prep for the highest math scores, because you might cover a topic in depth and say, this does appear on the test, but it might only appear on 1/4 of ACTs. On the SAT, the topics appear with greater regularity, but they're presented with different nuances and different twists to the problem. So you're not seeing the same exact things over and over again. It's not like it's hyper predictable, but the overall topic being tested is going to be the same. The way they test it is different. On the ACT, the topics themselves change more. So this would only apply to a student who's like already at or above a 32 in math and looking to improve from there. For students scoring lower than that, this usually is not where the additional points lie.
So you've now heard about the tests, and now you might be wondering, how do we pick? So we strongly believe the best way to pick between the tests is not to just have the student just sort of look at them both and decide, because for whatever reason, almost every kid is going to say they like the SAT better.
Because of that timing and fatigue factor, right?
Yes,
because
exactly.
the ACT feels more difficult. The SAT, you might feel more comfortable, but you don't realize you're missing questions.
Yes, exactly. So what we in fact think is the best way to do this is to just try taking one of each and see actually how you do. So many students will have a natural proclivity towards one of the exams. Usually that proclivity is not super strong, but it is really worth knowing, because that extra 50 points you might be having on one test, or 1 or 2 points on the ACT, that really matters as a baseline. If one test is far stronger than the other, the option is pretty clear. Just do the one that you're much better at. If in a more common scenario, the scores are pretty similar, we're going to take a more nuanced approach. And we are happy to offer a free consultation call, or we'll discuss that with you. And we will just sort of bring our expertise to that conversation, and we can decide with you what's the best choice for you and your family. The very best time to take those diagnostic exams are at the end of 10th grade or the beginning of 11th grade. And we tend to recommend doing that diagnostic testing as early as possible. We do offer free remote diagnostic testing to anyone, free of charge, as I just said. And we also provide a test recommendation based on that and feedback on your students performing. And again, that offer of a free test prep planning call, completely free of an obligation. So you don't need to continue working with us after that, but it's really just good to have that information, and we want everyone to have that information as much as possible. So another question that we get all the time is, if these tests are pretty similar to each other, should I just take both tests? And the answer is, you can do that if you really want to, but we would not recommend it. So basically the main point here is taking both tests is just pretty exhausting. And it's much better to just sort of really focus your prep on one test or the other for your maximum results. There are enough similarities between the two exams. Again, as I was saying right at the very beginning, the heart and soul of both of these tests, especially in those math sections, is that algebra 2 and geometry skills. So once you learn those skills, you can apply them to either exam. But there are enough differences between the tests that focusing your prep on just one of them is going to give you the best return on investment. The only people we really recommend take both are people that are in that 1550, 1570 range, or like a 34, 35 on the ACT, who really just need a good roll of the dice to see basically what side of the bed they're getting up on that morning for those last 30 points or the last 1 or 2 points on the ACT. For most people, though, that's not really going to make a lot of sense, and you much rather just sort of have that peace of mind of just taking one exam.
So registration for the test. By the way, I should mention, we're going to send out a copy of the slides to everyone here. So these links are live. So the registration for the fall SATs is already open. You can register for the test now. For the ACT, they open registration in July, but you can sign up for a text or email notification the day that it opens. Now, if you are in this webinar, that means you are on our mailing list. And if you are on our mailing list, that means that we will send you an email the day that the registration opens as well. You do want to register for a test as early as you know that you're taking that test, because while the registration deadlines aren't typically until about a month out from the test, individual test centers can fill up. Ideally, you take the test at your own high school. It's not required, but it's just nice to have an additional comfort level on what's going to be a relatively stressful morning. But if not your own high school, you want a short drive so you get more sleep. And then ideally, you would want a high school with some level of familiarity, again, for the stress factor. So if it's a high school you've been inside for a wrestling meet before or something like that, then that would be a better option than just a random high school of equal distance away. And then when you register, the tests are going to ask you for lots of optional information. So just know anything you fill out there that's optional is being sold to colleges so that they can market to you. Now, I want to be clear, parents, for those of you who have older students, you've probably been through this before around PSAT time, when you fill out a long questionnaire with a bunch of information before you take the PSAT. All of a sudden you start getting mail from colleges. So like a month or so after I took the PSAT, I got a letter from Harvard. I thought I was so special, The truth is Harvard wasn't recruiting me for anything. I reported that my grades were straight A's, and Harvard bought the list from College Board of all the students who reported that their grades were straight A's and sent them all some mail. Hey, come apply to Harvard. Colleges want more applicants. It's in their interest to keep their acceptance rates down, because that's how they go up in the US News and World Report rankings, among other factors that help them go up in those rankings. So the idea is, if you want to receive marketing materials from colleges, and some students do, because it's a great way to kind of be exposed to what schools are out there, be invited onto tours, you might get a discount code for a tour or something like that, go for it. If that stuff doesn't matter to you and you're happy to just kind of lead the charge on the college research yourself, then you can skip all of that optional information and probably save yourself like 30 minutes to an hour of registering for the test.
So we just wanted to take a second to offer some resources for students with accommodations, especially in this like slightly weird time when we're moving between the two tests. Accommodations are going to be at the top of a lot of people's minds. So we do have a blog post on our website, which is at this link, that explains like what the available SAT/ACT accommodations are and how to get them for the students that need them. We also have one of our founders was on a podcast discussing ACT and SAT accommodations, as well as college admissions, just sort of in general for students with accommodations. And you can always book a call out with me free of charge to discuss any questions you might have about accommodations, because I am sort of our resident accommodations person on the team. So I have a lot of expertise and experience working with pretty much every kind of accommodation student at this point, and I'm happy to talk to you.
And let me just reiterate that if your student has accommodations and you're not sure what to do, Tori is absolutely the person that you want to talk to. So this will be a link where you can book a call right into Tori's calendar.
That's true.
All right, now let's talk about how to actually prepare for the test, right? Which is our next step. So first, I'm going to talk about fundamentals of SAT, ACT prep. This is going to apply to any student preparing to take the test, whether you're prepping solo, whether you're doing a class, one-on-one tutoring, working with us or another company. It doesn't matter. These are the factors that are going to be relevant for every student. First of all, you want to be doing your practice in authentic testing conditions. That means you want to be practicing with your time limit. So for example, if you're getting really good at getting ACT reading questions right, but it's taking you longer than the test will actually give you, you're not actually getting better at ACT reading. You're getting better at the skill of reading comprehension, which is a piece of what you're going to need to get better at ACT reading, but it's not the whole thing, and it's not going to yield the score that you're looking for. So ideally, when you're taking a practice ACT, basically you take the test all back to back with a 10-minute bathroom and snack break in the middle between two sections. You want to identify and target your areas of personal need. So that means looking at what questions you're actually getting wrong in your practice and identifying where you need to improve in order to raise your score. And then being consistent is really important. So in general, for something like test prep, doing a little bit daily over a longer period of time is going to be better than, cram sessions sporadically. And then finally, use real tests. And what I mean by that is actual SATs written by the College Board and actual ACTs written by ACT. A lot of test prep companies make their own tests. When they do not invest anywhere near the time and resources and money into actually making those tests accurate, into bias testing for the questions. To go into, I don't have the stats on the digital SAT, but I know that about $2 million goes into the development of one test form for the SAT. You can bet that big box test prep companies who publish their own prep books with their own practice tests are not spending $2 million a pop. Definitely not 2 billion. $2 million a pop per practice test. That's just not happening. They don't have the resources to invest that kind of thing. And they're typically kind of shading the questions to illustrate the strategies that they're teaching you in the book. So they're not going to be authentic to what the SAT shows. They're going to be, kind of cheating the questions toward the strategy we just taught you on page 157 works perfectly here. So for that reason, you want to find real tests. They're very easy to find. If you need help locating them, please just contact us. Now, to talk a little bit more about our method. So the previous slide are things that everyone should consider no matter what. When you're working with us, this is what it looks like. We typically recommend starting about 12 weeks out from the test. That timeline can be longer in certain cases, it can be shorter in certain cases, but your typical student is going to start about 12 weeks out from the test. A student will complete a full timed practice test each week. Sometimes that can be abbreviated to portions of a practice test if we're honing in on a particular area, or if, for instance, we're working with one of those athletes that's in a sports season or, stage crew member during Hell Week or something like that. Of course, we're going to adjust the assignment appropriately. You meet with your tutor once a week for an hour-long session to target areas of need. Now, we're always going to be approaching areas of need from two vantage points. There's content. What do you actually need to know to get the question right? And then there's strategy. What's the best approach to the question? What are the tendencies of the test that are going to help you be more accurate in the long run? And, parents often ask us, do you focus on, content knowledge or test taking strategy? And the answer is yes. You cannot divorce the two. So just to give one example that I think lands pretty well, sometimes in the grammar section, you're trying to choose, what's the best punctuation mark for this sentence? Okay. So there's a certain order that you should test punctuation marks in. And independent of your ability to actually discern, what the rules are for those punctuation marks, testing them in this order will make you more accurate in the long run. At the same time, if you can't tell me what a semicolon actually does, you're not going to be very effective at testing the punctuation marks. So you need to have that underlying knowledge of what is a semicolon, what are the different comma rules that I might need to apply here, but also testing them in the order of, periods and semicolons and commas, etc., is going to make you more accurate in the long run. So of course, in my opinion, you can't really take the content away from the strategy. You need to be focusing on both of those things at the same time. And then, of course, the student will then integrate feedback from that session and the notes that they have from the session into taking their next practice test. So for every session, the tutor is going to have progress notes that they share with the parent, and they'll adjust their instruction to that next week and that next performance. student assignments are always going to be targeted towards area of need. So we're going to use the test as sort of a base template for the assignment, and we want students practicing on that test consistently. But if we notice, oh, this student's really struggling with comma rules, then we're going to assign a worksheet that, you know, helps them drill that skill in isolation before they come back to that authentic test context to apply it in exactly the way that the SAT and ACT will. So the tutor is going to monitor progress weekly and recap it to the parent. And then any issues that come up along the way, you know, we're going to solve them collaboratively. We believe that everyone involved in a student's success is a team, and that includes the student, their tutor, us at the office, and the parent. You know, the idea being, you know, we have these 4 parties that all want the student to succeed more than anything. And so if there's anything where one of the 4 of us can really weigh in and make a difference, of course, we're going to do that. The important thing is that, you know, you should consider test prep an investment. And that investment is going to involve certain inputs. It's going to involve your student's time. It's going to involve the parent's money and energy and stress, you know, mostly the student's energy, mostly the student's stress, but some energy and stress from the parents as well. And the outputs that we're looking to actually yield from this investment are more college options with that higher test score, and then also merit-based scholarship money, which can sometimes be a direct result of test scores. And sometimes, I should say, sometimes a direct result of test scores and GPA, sometimes just one of many factors in a merit-based scholarship. So you have merit-based scholarships that are more holistic in nature, meaning they're looking at the whole picture of a student. They might consider a written component in an application or something like that. There are some schools like the University of Alabama, which you can look up on their website as an out-of-state applicant to the University of Alabama, exactly what GPA and what test score gets you what amount of merit scholarship money. So there are some that are more based directly on test scores, some that are more, you know, where test scores will help but not get you there. And it's important to know that it's just one more way a test score can help you in this process. Okay, then it comes time to take your official test. So the week leading up to your test, it's important to get good sleep all week. Now, we've all had that situation where, you know, the day before something really important, it's hard to fall asleep that night because your mind is racing. And this happens a lot. The tests are typically on Saturday, unless you have a religious exemption to take it on Sunday. So if, you know, that Friday night, your thoughts are racing, you can't fall asleep, you know, you end up not getting great sleep that night. Well, if you got really great sleep all week, and especially Thursday, your body is going to be a lot more resilient to that one poor night of sleep than it would be otherwise. You want to make sure you have everything ready for test day the night before so that you're not scrambling in the morning, starting your day off stressed. We'll talk about what those are on the next slide. And then you don't want to overdo cramming the night or even nights before the test. Ideally, what you've done is prepared over a period of time. You've done all that work already. The rest and kind of making sure that you're all there physically and mentally is more important at that point than trying to cram in a bunch more prep work for the test. So I have a list here of what you should bring to the test. I'm not going to go through this because, you know, for our rising juniors and sophomores, the test is quite far off. But we send this checklist out to all of our families. It'll be in the slides that you get as part of this. The most important thing I think that most people don't think of, 2 of them, the final 2 bullet points. One is if you have a snack, make sure it's something that's easily disposed of. So if you have, for instance, a banana and you have a peel, you probably want to bring a Ziploc bag in case you have to shove it in your backpack because you don't know where the trash cans are in this strange high school you've never been in before. That's just like one of those little things to think about. And then also make sure you dress in layers, which is to say you don't control the thermostat in the room in which you take the test. So by dressing in layers, if it's cold, you keep them on. If it's warmer, you strip down to the lighter layers, and then you're able to control your body temperature, right? The less you leave up to chance this day, the better. And your physical comfort matters when you're taking a very long standardized test. Now, the day of your test, you know, we recommend just whatever your normal school day wake up routine is that works well for you. Do that. That includes caffeine. So I've had students ask me, you know, well, should I have coffee before the test? And I'm like, well, do you drink coffee? No. Do you think it's a good idea to completely change your routine and ingest a drug that you don't normally take the day before an important test or the day of an important test? No, so whatever your routine is, as far as coffee, breakfast, waking up, getting ready is concerned, stick to it. If it works for you, it works for you. You're not going to magically land on something else. You don't want to kind of reinvent the wheel on the day of your test. You want to plan to arrive no later than 7:45 a.m. So doors will close, so to speak, at 8. So make sure you're there by 7:45. When you're taking the test, pencils down means pencils down. We've had students have their scores canceled because they went back to erase stray marks in another section that they took previously. So, they just finished section 3. They're like, oh, during the break, I thought about my answer to number 47 in section 1 that was stuck in my head. Now I actually want to change my answer to D. If you do that, your scores will get canceled. Know your break schedule ahead of time so that you're not caught off guard. And then just note, as Tori mentioned earlier, there may be an experimental section that doesn't count toward your score. So just be prepared for that. Don't let it throw you off or make you more stressed than you need to be. Now, waiting for your scores. SAT releases scores like clockwork on the second Friday after your test. To my knowledge, they're not changing that timeline for the digital test, which is kind of crazy because they should have the scores like within a couple hours after you take the test, but so be it. For the ACT, your scores will start to be released the second Tuesday after your test, but depending on your situation, they may be released much later than that. So ACT releases them over a span of time, where SAT releases them on the dot every time. Students who take the test with extended time, and particularly students with the stronger accommodation to take the test over multiple days, are typically going to receive their scores later. And that's because typically they're completing the test later than other students. Okay, so now we've talked about taking the official test, and our final step was to consider a retake if needed. So what I wanted to do is look at a couple of hypothetical students and sort of how we would weigh in on the decision for this student to retest again or not. So this student came to us with an SAT diagnostic score of 1220. Their last 3 practice scores were all in the 1300 to 1340 range. And on the official test, they scored 1410. This student doesn't have a specific college in mind or a specific goal score. They were just trying to do the best that they could. This student, I would absolutely advise to not take the test again. And there are 2 main reasons. One is the student improved 190 points from their diagnostic score. That's a very strong level of improvement. 2 is the student scored 70 points higher than their best practice test. That would mean they'd need to make a considerable improvement for us to even expect them to score the same. So there would be so much test prep involved in trying to raise the 1410 here that it probably just wouldn't be worthwhile from a time and money standpoint for the family. So for this student, we would say, great job, way overperforming your practice test scores. You caught lightning in a bottle. You had your best day on the right day. That's awesome. Congratulations, you're done. And that would be our advice. Now, if this student really wanted to retest, we will help them with whatever they choose. All we can do is give our best advice. At the end of the day, of course, students and parents, the decision is up to you and your family. The one exception I would say is for this student, if they fell in love with a college that had a score where, a score range where we would see, 1440 would actually make a huge difference here, then maybe it makes sense to continue to prepare if there is that very focused goal to shoot for. So that brings us to student number 2 here, who had a diagnostic score of 1350. Last practice scores were in the 1480 to 1520 range, but then the student scored 1420. Now, this student should absolutely test again. They really underperformed relative to their practice tests. The practice tests that we use are official tests, so that we expect them to be a very reliable predictor of student performance. It happens to a few of our, I shouldn't even say a few, it happens to quite a few of our students every year where their first official test, they get a lot of anxiety around it. They're not able to stay focused and they underperform. And these students, typically, they're not doomed to a lower score because of their test anxiety or something like that. We're able to work with them on that. And just having that experience under their belt will allow them to kind of be more calm and relaxed and in control for their second test date. This is a student that should absolutely test again. Their goal scores were right at their practice test score range, and they scored way below that. However, they don't necessarily need a ton of prep. We may do a few focus sessions on sort of managing test anxiety and making sure that they're staying in control on test day, but we're not going to recommend another 12 weeks of test prep when they're already scoring on an ability level where they need to be. They just need to learn better. How can I make sure my ability actually translates to the day of the test? So for this student, we would recommend a couple sessions and take the test again. All right, now we've gone through all of this. I want to talk now about test optional, which is, of course, the big buzzword in the standardized testing world ever since COVID. So test optional is not something that was new during COVID. I think Bates was test optional in the 1960s. It used to be sort of limited mostly to small liberal arts schools. Now almost everyone is test optional. There are a few schools that have returned to requiring scores. They are mostly in the South and mostly state schools. So for example, the Florida State University system, the University of Tennessee, these are schools that do require testing. Now, so if your student is really looking for, sun and a big state school, then test optional is probably not something you want to think too much about in this process. Even so, the best way to apply to college is with a strong test score. So it's always been the case in college admissions, way before test optional was a common thing, that, when something is optional, it's in your best interest to do it. When a college has an optional essay, no one thinks twice about not submitting that essay if they're serious about attending that college. And so a standardized test score is the same way. If you have a strong score, it will help you. It's just the same way it always has. Test optional means that if you have a score that's well below a school's criteria, you don't have to submit it. It's worth noting that, at the different schools that have released data on this, students who are applying with test scores are being admitted at a higher rate. Now, not many colleges release this data. Unfortunately, there's not much transparency. But at the same time, colleges are really able to, learn more about a student with the test score and admit them with more confidence. So one thing to think about when you're applying test optional is how long a college has been test optional. Colleges that were test optional before the pandemic, chances are you're going to have better luck applying test optional there without a test score, because they decided before their hand was forced by circumstance that it was a fine way to admit students. Whereas colleges that, for instance, Purdue just went back to requiring test scores this year. Last year, when they were test optional, 93% of their admitted students submitted test scores, right? So they were not really as test optional as optional sounds. Test optional is an umbrella term. Purdue's website said the same thing as Pepperdine's website. Pepperdine admits 37% of their students with test scores. More than half don't submit test scores. Purdue and Pepperdine have opposite views on quite how optional test scores are. The wording on their websites was almost identical. So your best case scenario is to submit a score that college would be happy to see and happy to admit. And that's why we recommend, especially early on in this process, students plan to test. When it comes time to decide where to submit that score or not, it's a more complicated equation. I would say most of our students in general are going to be submitting their score to their target and likely schools to be more confident there. But as a general rule for a reach school, you're not submitting the test score because, of course, the fact that it is a reach is because you're a little bit below what their published, averages are. So when you're below that published average, that's when you want to consider not submitting. When you're above it, of course, you want to submit it. It's going to be an asset on your application. Final thing I'll say about this is that, anyone who does test prep with us gets our office as their test prep advisor. So you have Tori and I behind the scenes. If you have any questions about the big picture, your students working with a tutor on the actually getting better at the test. And then meanwhile, questions you have about the big picture, SAT versus ACT. Should I submit my test score to this school or not? You have me and Tori to help you throughout the process with those decisions. So, you're not going to be flying blind here. Anyone who does any amount of test prep with us will get our free advice on where they should and shouldn't submit the score, as well as we can help them figure it out. All right, so thank you everyone for joining us. Now we get to move into a Q&A portion. So if you haven't yet, please drop questions into the chat. And the first question that we have, Tori, this is one for you. When is the best time to apply for SAT or ACT accommodations?
The best time to apply is yesterday, and the second best time to apply is today. So it really also does kind of depend on which test you're taking. So ACT, in order to get the accommodations, you have to actually register for the test, which is super annoying. You can then just pay for the change fee. But you basically want to apply for the soonest test you possibly can so that they will actually take your accommodation request seriously and get it to you as soon as possible. And then you can just change it to whenever you want to actually take the test. For SAT, it's a little bit more. So for what it's worth, though, ACT does approve pretty much everybody that has, actually, they do just automatically approve everybody that has a 504 at school or an IEP. It's a little bit more complicated if you go to private school, and you can definitely reach out to me and I can talk you through the details if you have any more like individual questions. But the main point is ACT will just give you the accommodations. You don't really need to be super concerned about it. SAT is a little bit more complicated, but it's pretty much the same basic overall like structure, although you don't actually need to be doing a test in order to like get the accommodations. So there's that. The only thing you want to be keeping in mind for SAT accommodations in particular is do not have your kid take the PSAT without their accommodations. For some reason, every year we have a couple of parents that are like, we just sort of want to see how they do. And the issue with that is if they have like, say you have a kid that's just like on fire that day, they do pretty well without their accommodations, the SAT then is less likely to actually grant any accommodations at all on the real test. So any accommodations that they deserve to have based on their 504 and their psych ed testing, give them all of those accommodations and make sure that there is that demonstrated need going forward. You don't want to mess around with that because they deserve to have their accommodations. Then that's just sort of the long and short of it.
Yeah. One final point on that is that College Board grants accommodations for all College Board testing at once. So if your student already took an AP exam with extended time, or they took a PSAT with extended time, they already have it for the SAT. The same would go if they get it all in place for their PSAT or the SAT. If they're taking APs next spring, they'll already have that extra time in place for that AP. So that is a difference as well. Another question we just got, we are going to shoot for a September ACT. Should we register for October ACT, the next test date, just in case before getting the results back? This is in general a wise decision. And that's because ACT, they can release scores back on a later timeline. So if you get them towards the end of that 6-week period, you're not going to have time to register for October. In addition, so many colleges super score now that it's typically in a student's best interest to test more than once. We recommend to most people planning to test twice. The idea of being one and done is really nice, but it's rare in a test with 4 sections for a student to have their best performance in all 4 sections on the same day. Statistically, it's just not likely. So the idea is if you're really happy with 3 of your scores, but you can improve 1, well, then you can, do a course of prep just for that 1 section and really aim to improve that. Maybe you improve one of the other ones too. But you can really target 1 section and improving there as a way to improve.
Yes, and also for what it's worth, the College Board has said they will super score between the 2 different types of SAT. So that's not really to do with your question, Brendan, but
that is a very good point. College Board has said that they're recommending that colleges super score between the 2 different versions of the test. It is up to individual colleges' discretion whether they actually do. So this is something we're going to be monitoring in terms of what colleges' individual policies are. Some colleges, may opt to super score across the 2 SAT versions. Others may not. So, we'll keep you posted as that develops. Another question, charges for test prep. Also, is PSAT prep different from SAT or ACT? So our current pricing for test prep, virtually it's $135 per hour. In person, which is available in some parts of the greater Philadelphia area, it's 165 per hour. Now for PSAT prep, is it different from SAT or ACT prep? Yes and no. And what I mean by that is for the rising juniors, yes, it will be very different, because the PSAT will be in the digital format, and a student who is preparing for the SAT in the fall is going to be taking the paper format. Now, there's only one reason to prepare for the PSAT, and that is to potentially qualify for national merit, which means you have to score in the top 1% of your state. So for that reason, students who are preparing for the PSAT are pretty much always on the early SAT prep timeline and taking the test in the fall, because they are advanced in math if they're able to score that high on the PSAT. For 97% of students, I would not recommend preparing for the PSAT. It's going to be a waste of time. It's mostly just a practice test. Colleges will never see it. If you have a chance to score high enough for national merit, it can make sense to prepare for. So for rising juniors, you're basically preparing for two different tests, the paper SAT and the digital SAT, or the paper ACT and the digital SAT. The PSAT will be in the exact format of the digital SAT. For the rising sophomores and any students younger than that, test prep for the SAT and PSAT is going to look very similar because they'll both be in the digital format. There are some subtle differences, I guess you'd say, between the PSAT and the SAT. Basically, just the level of the questions on the PSAT is a little lower because it's aimed at younger students. So where the SAT is, you know, like we said, it's curved to a hypothetical population of combined 11th and 12th graders. The PSAT is curved just based on that grade level. So the prep will look, mostly what we do is prep students for the SAT. It's sort of like resistance training for the PSAT. You're doing a harder version of the same thing, but we will have students do a practice PSAT test or two before the PSAT, just to make sure that they're, you know, comfortable with kind of the adjustment in difficulty level. All right, any other questions for us? Okay, well, thank you all for attending. If you have any other questions, you know where to reach us. Our email and phone numbers here. You can always text or call the office. Really glad that you all turned up for the presentation tonight, and we'll send out all the slides and everything you need to know later. We're also going to have a recording of this webinar up on YouTube, and we have a recording of our digital SAT webinar up on YouTube as well, where we go in much greater depth on the actual nuances of the new test and what makes it different from the current version of the test. So if you're curious, we'll include that in the notes that we send out on this presentation. So thanks again, everybody, for joining us, and have a great night. Bye-bye.